We're going to go ahead and move on to our first panel. We're going to shine a spotlight on a topic that no one is talking about, AI and data center demand and how it impacts transmission. I mean, actually, you can't have a conference without this topic. I think these days it's mandatory. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for our panel and turn it over to him, and then he will introduce all of our panelists. Moderating our panel will be Michael Tierney. Michael is with WIRE's member Continuum Industries. Michael, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Larry. All right, thank you, Larry, and good morning, everyone. So the topic du jour is AI data center load growth, and what does it mean for transmission? So as Larry mentioned, I'm with Continuum Industries, and I find this topic personally very interesting because we are at the nexus of that. We are an AI data platform used for transmission routing. So we're both, in a small sense, the cause of and trying to help be the solution to this challenge. So a topic that came up a lot earlier today, AI data center and its impact on transmission. That conversation, as Lanny pointed out, is not solved by any one utility, any one ISO. It takes all of us to figure that out. So WIRES has pulled together a fantastic panel touching on three main areas in that, answering that question. So to my left, we have Patrick Arness with Dominion at the epicenter of data center load growth. He has a very targeted opinion and perspective on the impact at the utility level. Next to him, we have excuse me, McNeill with the Data Center Coalition. So he represents a coalition of the folks that are bringing this load to our doorstep for us to address. And finally, we have Aubrey Johnson with MISO, responsible for a large-scale region. And as VP of System and Resource Planning, he's got to solve this across a large chunk of the country. So our objective today is to have an open conversation with these three independent perspectives. I will ask questions for the first portion of this, start the conversation, but really this is about the WIRES team here. Ask the questions that you want to hear, and let's have an open conversation. So to put some context to this, AI data centers represented a little over 4% of U.S. load in 2023. That is projected by DOE and the industry to double or triple by 2028. So there is no question there's a significant load increase. But first question for the panel I'll pose is, this isn't historically unique. We've seen significant load growth in the country before. Rural electrification in the 30s and 40s, post-World War II industrialization in the 50s and 60s, even the PC revolution in the 90s. So first question is this unique? And if so, slightly leading question, why is transmission at the center of the answer? And to my left, I'll point it to you, Patrick.
So can everyone hear me? Okay. For us, it's certainly the biggest growth we've seen since World War II. It's unique just because technology is always evolving. So how are we as a utility adapting to both the technology and then the customer demands? So things become more complex. So I think in that way, it's unique. For us, about 4 gigawatts data centers, 450 data centers connected, more than the next 4 markets worldwide combined. So we have a lot that we're working through in trying to meet those challenges in, as Lanny was talking about, resource adequacy, reliability, ensuring that costs are as affordable as possible for customers. Those are real challenges right now. So I think in that way, yeah, it's new.
Great.
Sure, I can go. So again, thank you, WIRES, for having me here on this panel. We talk a lot about AI data centers, but I think it's also important to put in context that data centers also support everyday life for everybody in this room, right? See people on computers, people on their phones, right? Those are all going through data centers. If you think about your own household data use, the average household in the US has 21 connected devices. I live in a 900 square foot apartment in DC, and I have 50. So there's just, data centers just basically enable everything we do, from telehealth, from work, from school, right? So AI is going to be revolutionary in the healthcare space, in the financial space. But I think we also have to focus on what has kind of gotten us here today for data centers, and that's really the cloud-based operations and everybody's daily use of connected devices. And when I think about transmission, I think of it as a really important tool to kind of enable load growth, right? Whether it's interregional transmission, being able to get generation to where it needs to be with the load, or even just congested lines to make sure that energy can get to data centers. We've seen real-life stories about in Northern Virginia, a place in California, where data centers have kind of sat dormant because they couldn't get the energy they needed. On average, it takes between 12, 18 to 2 years to build a data center. But we're seeing transmission line timelines from 5 to 7 years. So we really think that there's an important role for transmission with data centers. And one thing we advocate for, especially at the federal level, is permitting reform, which we heard from Lanny earlier. Really trying to find some certainty in those timelines and make sure that we can build transmission to meet the load growth. So transmission is definitely a very important part.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. So from my perspective, I think about this, and Patrick and his company in that part of the country has probably been the epicenter and they've dealt with this for the longest. But the biggest thing that I think about when I think about the impact of data centers is it's everywhere. And so every region has some level of penetration on this as well also. Every state that I support has some level of interest there as well also. I think the other thing that I would argue or I would make a comment on, that I think that there are things we have not seen that are tertiary effects of what happens with the data centers. In many cases, these areas, these data centers are going into rural areas, and they are completely changing the tax bases of those areas. And that's leading to buildings being built and other things that are going to come downstream themselves of the data center itself. So the data center might be the big load, but think about all the other secondary loads that are going to come along with that. And I think those are some of the things that I think offer us some real challenges as well also. The other thing that I would think about is, what's the impact of transmission? Transmission's sole purpose is to get energy from where it was made to where it's going to be used. And fundamentally, that's going to be different places for both these data centers. It's going to be different about how we think about the changes in our communities. And it's also, if we're candid and recognize that there's some level of resource change that's going to take place in this country regardless. I like to tell people all the time that I grew up working in coal plants. My first job with Georgia Power Company, I worked at a 7-unit, 1,300 megawatt coal plant that had 297 people there. My first job as a plant manager was to build a combined cycle plant that was 1,300 megawatts, had 28 people there, and I was one of them. And so the enemy of coal is no longer wind or solar, it's gas. And so fundamentally, where's the pipeline? Well, if I get the pipeline, I can't get the pipeline where the people is. So I have to have a way to get the energy from where the pipeline is and the turbine to where the people are. And so no matter what we do, as we see the increase in gas, as we see the increase in wind, we see the increase in solar, you can't build commercial solar in downtown Minneapolis. Just ain't gonna work, right? And so how do you think about where those opportunities are? And the role of transmission is simply to get the energy to where it's most needed.
All right. Thank you. Now, we're talking about that load growth. AI being projected to be 70% of the data center load growth over the next 5 or so years. But there's a big range in those estimates. Are we going to increase by 6 on the low end, 12% in the high end? Aubrey, maybe I'll throw this one to you. How do we ensure we make the right investments with that uncertainty in the forecast that we've got over the next 5 to 10 years?
So in MISO, what we do when we start thinking about this is, and we're building transmission portfolios in our long-range transmission planning process, we develop a set of scenarios, a set of futures, if you will, and really work that and vet that through the stakeholder process and ultimately make a decision based upon the best inputs we can have on what should we target, what expansion should we account for. And so fundamentally, let me just say this, we're all wrong, right? We're all wrong. So the conversation is, there's a great, since we're in golf world here, Ben Hogan says golf is a game of misses. the best golfers have the fewest misses. They have the best misses. And so we have to think about that as we think about electricity as well also. We can't be perfect in trying to understand and estimate what that load growth is going to be. We have to expect and think about a range of what that load growth will be and be confident in our ability to build to that. And I'll agree with Lanny in that sense. There's not been a transmission line that's been put into service that hadn't been found a way for it to be used and useful. And so part of what we've got to do is really try to drive the message that we're not trying to be perfect. We're not trying to be exact. We're trying to make our best estimate of how we can build something and give us something to build off of.
And Sai, maybe you can give us your perspective on that from the data center developer side, how confident they are in their load demand.
Yeah, so I think, as Aubrey said, most forecasts are wrong in the long term. But what the data center industry is really committed to is collaborating with utilities, RTOs and ISOs and policymakers to make sure that we all have insight into kind of, one, how the utility forecasts are put together, and then two, how data centers can kind of contribute to that. So we've been talking with folks around the country, and one thing we're hearing is that historical data has not been a good marker for utilities to plan for future load. So we're kind of working, with utilities one-on-one or within RTOs, whether it's PJM, MISO, to really try to help right-size kind of load forecasts going forward. We don't want to see overbuild, but we also don't want to see underbuild. I talked about earlier how we've seen data center facilities kind of sit dormant while we wait for the needed infrastructure to be built. So we're really leaning in as an industry. I want to be a collaborative partner with the utility industry, with the RTOs, to make sure that we have the most robust, good forward-looking forecast that we can. So we're really here to be a constructive partner in that.
Great. And you mentioned collaboration with utilities in there. And I think for Patrick and Sai, Patrick, you are at the center of Dominion and the epicenter, as I said, of data center load growth.
Dominion's at the epicenter. I'm not at the center.
You are not personally at the center. You just live. Yeah. So maybe you and Sai can give us some insight on how you see that relationship working out, how you can work more closely together to achieve, the mutual needs.
Broken record, collaboration is key. We'll look at PJM's forecasts. We'll compare that with our forecast in terms of how we're talking with our customers and their expectations of energy use. And I think some of this reminds me, at least a much bigger scale, of electric transportation. We need to be speaking the same language. Right? These are different businesses. We are regulated differently than the technology community. We need to be understanding the risks for both, the things that are going to be harder for us to overcome. We have regulatory filing every 2 years that we need to go to our commission. So I think having some common language helps a lot in trying to manage expectations. And from a Dominion side, we kind of have a multi-step process, particularly with the data centers, on engineering letters of authorization, construction authorization, and getting to the electric service agreement to sort of more accurately, at least in our mind, project what's going to be needed going forward. And we feel pretty good in terms of how that's been working. But that doesn't happen without a lot of discussions early and often.
I was just going to reiterate Patrick's point. Collaboration is super important. And when we talk about, similar terminology, when I say co-location around data centers, I still get a very confused look from my members when I'm talking about energy. So I understand the struggle personally there. But Dominion's been a great partner to the data center industry, and obviously Virginia is the biggest data center market in the world. And so what we're thinking too is, how can other utilities around the country kind of piggyback off what Dominion has done historically and take kind of lessons learned from that. So we're really trying to make sure that we have open lines of communication with all utilities that we're working with. But historically, utilities that have seen load growth from data centers, there are probably some best practices that we can take, and hopefully that other utilities can kind of work into their load forecasting as well. So I think reiterate Patrick's point, collaboration is kind of key there, just making sure there are open lines of communication.
So I'd offer too, if anybody knows anything about the MISO stakeholder process, it's not for the faint at heart, if you will, and it's not for people who don't like meetings. And so one of the things that I have been really, really surprised about is I've had some discussions with especially large data center folks, Amazon, Google, you name it. And to the extent that they are engaged in our stakeholder process has blown me away. When I'm talking to someone and they're talking to me and they're mentioning something about the February interconnection process working group meeting, and they were there, and I was like, hell, I don't even go to that, right? You know. And so they are really rolling up their sleeves and trying to understand how the processes work to figure out how they should be inserting themselves into that, and also to think about what are some of the things they need to go back and talk to our member utilities about. And so I would say that one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is, as this demand is growing, they are putting forth the effort to understand where they should be inserting, how they can insert, and how they can accelerate the process to get connected and have sufficient generation to serve what they're trying to do.
All right. So you mentioned in there getting connected. A big part of this process, both for the generation we'll need to bring online and for the developers that bring data centers online, is that interconnection process. And I'll go back to you, Aubrey, on this. Do you feel our current process is sufficient? Loaded question. Or are there changes to that process we need to bring about to keep up with the pace of growth we need to meet?
Yeah. So I think there's actually two pieces of this. And so for me, I want to talk first about the load process and the load concept of it. So basically, data center knocks on the door and says, we're bringing load. More often than that, that doesn't fall into our 18-month cycle. So we're having to do what's called expedited project request to evaluate what that load is, what's required for that load to integrate into the system and to keep the system whole. We're having to accelerate that. We're doing that now at a rate that's probably 6 to 7 times what we were seeing 3 years ago. Our current MTEP cycle will be roughly $11 billion, and about $6 billion of that is going to be expedited project requests to support spot loads. That's not just data centers, but that's just loads are knocking on the door quickly. Going back to fast forward, the conversation is really around the interconnection process. The interconnection process that exists today was not intended for what we're doing today. And so fundamentally, in the MISO system, we have a coincident peak of roughly 126 gigawatts. Our 2023 cycle had 170 gigawatts show up in it, right? It's just not sustainable. And so over the last several years, we've done a lot to really kind of change that process and really change what the concepts are. We've moved to where we've got all these cluster studies, but we've also eliminated penalty-free withdrawal. We've also gotten a recent passing for a cap. So basically, going forward, any of our interconnection queue cycles will be limited to 50% of our coincident peak load, which today would be roughly 78 gigawatts. That's still a lot to study, but fundamentally, we can do that differently. Again, people listening to the MISO's process, I got a call from Commissioner Rogers' office to say, hey, we need to talk to you all about what you're doing with this technology and with Pearl Street technology. So long story short, we started working and looking at something that SPP was doing probably 2 years ago. And really, the Pearl Street really improved the modeling process. And so we started working with them about improving our modeling process. And then fundamentally, we said, well, wait a minute. If we can do this, what about doing the actual analysis? And if we can do the analysis, what about estimating the actual cost of it? So, right now, we're trying to figure out how to change the game to really accelerate that. And as Lanny is talking about SPP being able to do a queue cycle inside of a year, we're pretty confident that we're on that trajectory also. And so fundamentally, we've got to get to a point of where from the time you start a queue to the time that you close that out and sign all the generator interconnection agreements, that happens in less than a year. I think that'll bring more certainty, that'll bring more viability, and it'll make the process better across the board. And it's not just for the data centers, exactly, because, again, there's a resource transition going on, period. And so in the MISO region, we've actually seen on a projection that said we've got to have 20 gigawatts of new resources come online for the next 20 years. That's a lot. So we've got to be prepared to do that as well as dealing with the data center loads that's come along the way.
And let's get the opinion from the utility and data center side. How's the process working for you?
So, taking a cluster approach has helped. Kind of where I end up falling back to a little bit is PJM could approve all the projects in the queue. You could sign interconnection agreements. You still need the people. You still need permits. At the end of the day, to get things built, whether it's transmission, it takes a long time. You run into Clean Water Act issues, National Historic Preservation Act issues, lots of local opposition, particularly in our neck of the woods. So I think there's another part of the equation here on getting things both approved but then built, both on a generation and transmission side, that need to be tackled.
Yeah, and I would just say, to Aubrey's point, right, the current interconnection processes probably weren't anticipating this type of load growth going forward. But stuff we're really excited to see, especially in MISO, is the sugar implementation from the Pearl Street technologies. I think the timeline shrank from 686 days to 10 days to do that analysis. So that was something we were really excited to see. So we're really kind of looking forward to seeing how AI and automation can really help in the interconnection process. And then obviously, FERC Order 2023, excited to see that fully implemented across the regions, and hopefully that can improve some of the interconnection processes as well.
There's one other thing that Patrick kind of alluded to that's been an issue for me. In the MISO interconnection queue, there's over 57 gigawatts of signed interconnection agreements today, and half of those are behind schedule relative to their commercial operation date. And if you look across the organized markets, that number is over 260 gigawatts of signed interconnection agreements. And so there's tremendous opportunity there, but the rate of build is not what it needs to be to support any of the needs that are there. And as much as we want to pound the table and talk about interconnection queues and the problems with interconnection queues, we should be pounding the table talking about what's happening to the stuff that's already been agreed upon and why it's not getting built. And there's a myriad of reasons around that, but it's insufficient to be stuck on that. And one of the things that the word is the 7 most expensive words in business is, this is how we've always done it. And I think we're stuck on that relative to how we think about interconnection agreements, how we think about where they want to go and all those things. And we've got to be willing to take a more aggressive look around permitting, building, and other stuff like that, because I can improve all the interconnection processes in the world, but if all I'm doing is setting up another queue on the backside of the analysis, what are we really accomplishing?
Yeah, that's a great point, Aubrey. And as you mentioned, accelerating the interconnection studies are going to help. But Patrick, as you pointed out, there are problems with the permitting after that and keeping the projects we approved on schedule. So since we're talking today about how we support AI, what are the opinions of the panel on how AI can support us? How can we be leveraging that technology to better address the challenges?
I'll start because I'm in rehab on AI. For the longest, I was like, yeah, that's nice, but I got to have somebody on the other side to actually interpret and understand what we're getting out of that. When I think about the stuff we're doing with Pearl Street, that's not necessarily per se AI. That's really brute force system engineering and taking advantage of 40+ years of system engineering development to get there. However, there are things that we can do, and we are already working on those things, where we start looking at using AI to answer questions from our stakeholders, using AI on the backside of this Pearl Street implementation to develop the report to talk about what all the mitigations are and all the analysis that have been done. So I think that there are things that are actually that are simple things that I think become a gateway to becoming more comfortable in how we use that. Just last week, my team, my economic and policy planning team, really gave a presentation on machine learning. And we're stepping into that space because fundamentally, again, I think Lanny mentioned this, with machine learning and artificial intelligence kind of looking at those things together, you can actually start having many, many more simulations and other things to kind of go through the process to give you different, more precise or different outputs. But here's a warning I want to also say also is, one of the things we have to be very, very careful about is more choices don't always mean better. They can lead us to analysis paralysis. And so that's the actual enemy of some of the work we want to try and do anyway. So I think that there's a space for this. I think it is something that we have to really kind of think about how we accelerate the use of, but we also have to think about what might be some of the limitations of what the use is also.
I think you can look at use of AI for studies for routing. You can look at it for vegetation growth and what that looks like in and around a right-of-way. How do we ensure that it's properly maintained? And you can kind of predict, well, this grows at this rate, we need to be over there and trim it before sort of whatever storm season, so we're prepared and trying to protect our equipment and customers. And customer interaction, dynamic line rating, like there are efficiencies throughout that where you can use AI to help the larger system. I don't think it's just going to be one thing, but there are bits and pieces that we're using that are helping.
Yeah, and I would just say, Patrick touched on this, right? Grid enhancing technologies, Lanny also touched on this, utilizing the grid we have, and all that is done through data centers, right? So it's all kind of circular here. We talk about load growth with data centers, but how can data centers enable broader efficiencies of the grid? And I think use of dynamic line ratings, topology optimization, some of those grid enhancing technologies is really important to make sure that we're, one, utilizing the grid that we have, and then two, optimizing the future grid. So really excited about all the kind of work in 1920 and 1920A, and hopefully that gets implemented across the regions as well to see more of that.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm in rehab, but I also want to just continue to offer this thought to you to think about it this way, this analogy. We think about the evolution of flying and really fighter jets. Through like the 70s, Vietnam War, the plane was a limitation, not the pilot. Today, for the planes that we have, the pilot is a limitation. The plane can do far more than the pilot can. The pilot can't keep up with the plane. I think we have to be very careful and understand that as we step into this world today. For years, our tools were the limitation, not the engineer. Today, the engineer is probably the limitation when we think about the applications that may be available for us with AI and other things along those lines. So it's a learn measured. We have to grow to meet what that capability is.
All right, so I've got one more question for the group, and then we're going to open it up to the room. So please, everyone start preparing your questions. For my own interest, given your three opinions, if you could hand wave one challenge, one obstacle to building new transmission and make it go away, what would it be? Sai, you look like you want to go.
Well, I didn't want Patrick to take mine, so I'll say permanent reform. I mentioned earlier, right? The timelines for permits for transmission lines have, varied. I saw a study where, sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's 11 years, right? And so one, that doesn't create the certainty for the transmission developer, but two, for the final customer who may be waiting on that line, if you don't have certainty that it will be delivered within 2-3 years, but 10 years, right? We need to make sure that, the load actually knows when they can come online, because data centers just sitting dormant don't help anybody. It doesn't expand our AI capabilities. It doesn't expand our nationwide compute, and it doesn't help our companies because they can't be using that. So I would say permitting reform, anything that can get some certainty into the transmission construction timelines, and also, I would just say more certainty around that would be my magic wand ask.
Patrick, did Sai steal your answer?
Permitting reform. We obviously just went through the RTEP process. We had 13 projects, including joint venture 765. We've never done that. It's going to be hard. And I think for us, one issue that we've run into, judicial review would be a nice one to have in terms of when and how opponents are able to engage in expressing their opposition to a project. It often creeps up what we feel is far too long afterward, and it creates the uncertainty and delays things when we need it now.
Can I not follow instruction and have two things?
Absolutely.
So one is, I do think we have to be prepared to accept and deal with technology and technology advancement. 765 technology is not new technology, it just hadn't been built a whole lot. And so now when you look across the board here, MISO of our tranche 2.1, 9 of the 24 projects have some level of 765 lines built into it. SPP's got a 765 line. Patrick just talked about the 2 765 lines that are going in PJM. And so fundamentally, everybody's needing to get comfortable with, we're going to have big power transfer. We got to think about doing something different than what we've always done and be comfortable with that. My team hates it when I say this, but the biggest challenge to building transmission is not the engineering, it's figuring out who's going to pay for it. And so fundamentally, I always go back to that to say, when we think about multi-value transmission, we've got to think about things like value of lost load. If you want to evaluate resiliency, what number does Atlantic use and SPP use versus what does MISO use? And then how do the people who don't support transmission use what we used against us in that regard to have the debate? So thinking really about cost allocation, thinking really about some variables that everyone uses in some way, shape, or form to evaluate the benefits of it would be super helpful as we think about, valuing lost load and trying to evaluate the resiliency of transmission lines. And so I always go back to cost allocation. So here's the thing that he mentioned. He mentioned the JTIQ study, and we did that 5 years ago. It took us a little over 15, 16 months to identify the portfolio. It took us 2 years to get cost allocation and the JOA changes done.
All right, so thank you for answering my questions. That was the easy part. Now we'll open it up to the room.
I'm going to go ahead and start, and then we'll move over to some of the others. But I was going to start off by asking, can you talk a little bit about the reliability needs associated with data centers, how they are differ from other loads, and how does that impact or play into building out the infrastructure in order to accommodate them?
I can take the first stab, but so data centers aren't monolithic, right? We think of AI and data centers, but really data centers have different operational characteristics on what kind of facilities they're hosting. So I have an example where one of our members is connected directly to the New York Stock Exchange. They had to measure out the fiber cables to make sure that they were exactly the same length because there couldn't be any latency differences between the trading platforms. That is a facility that needs to be on called 5 nines, 99.999% of the time. You can't turn that off, and if the grid, something does happen to the grid, they have to go to their backups, right? So it really depends on kind of the data centers, but a lot of our data centers are used for things like healthcare, things like schoolwork, things like banking, right? We have a member that is a major credit card company, and they do 31,000 credit card transactions a second through their data center facility in Ashburn, Virginia. That's stuff that you can't turn off, right? You need to have power 99.999% of the time. So the reliability needs are real, and data centers are pretty flat load, right? They don't turn on and off. The internet never really sleeps. It's pretty flat throughout the day. So reliability is super important for our members, and as we think about transmission specifically, that has a big part to play in the reliability needs of our facilities. So I would put reliability as probably the number one thing around energy for us.
For me, I bank on them all being the 5 nines, right? And you can adjust if you're not. This is my data center, and it never runs out of power, right? And so I just don't think we ought to think about that. I think we ought to think about the highest requirements and plan for those.
Yeah, I mean, the value is in the reliability. And, as we talked about what's affordable, like we are investing a lot of money in upgrading our transmission system and distribution system. Our average outage rate has gone down 75%. We just exceeded 5 nines. So for us, we're seeing a proof in the investment, hopefully benefiting our customers in a larger system.
I think that's something we should highlight more, because people talk about who should be paying for it and all this other stuff. I think the residual resiliency and reliability that will flow throughout all of these communities as a result of some of the development and the infrastructure that should not be underestimated.
Craig first. Thank you. Is this on? Craig Glazer from PJM. And we're in the unenviable position of having a show cause order on us with regard to data centers. I'm not going to drive out. You don't have to leave because I'm not going to talk about it. I promise you, I'm not going to talk about it. Just wanted to note that. But we spent a lot of time talking about interconnection, but that's generator interconnection. And data centers are retail loads. We're talking about load interconnection, which is frankly both a TO, but largely a state-driven process. The state has jurisdiction rather than the FERC over that issue for the most part. So just keep that in mind. The jurisdictional issues are kind of complicated here. And let me give a scenario related to transmission, so nothing in the docket here. Data centers are in competition with each other. So data centers choosing between state A, state B, or state C. Okay, it makes the choice, it meets with the governors, it makes a deal with the governor in state A. It says, I'm going to support that data center. I want it in my state. Okay, transmission needs to be built for that data center. Under today's paradigm, the costs of that transmission, particularly if it's a high voltage, will be socialized to other states. How is state B and C that lost the race, if you will, going to be very happy about paying to support the ribbon cutting for the governor in state A for the data center? And is state B and C going to be willing to cite a transmission line running through their state to support, the governor's ribbon cutting in state A for the data center? So I just ask people to think about that scenario, because you've got transmission, which is a federally regulated asset, but you've got the load interconnection of load is a retail issue and subject to governors and state PUCs, et cetera. And you got cost allocation policies that may not fit what the individual winning governor or losing governor may want to see. So help me through that as a group. And hopefully our FERC people can still stay. Thank you.
So let me offer something in that regard, because I think Craig makes a great point. This is also understanding the environment that you're in. So each of the different RTOs, ISOs, and or non-organized markets are going to all see and deal with this differently. In the MISO space, we've done a lot of work with our long-range transmission planning, which I think helps the region overall. But if we look at where we're seeing all this low growth in the South and throughout the region, those projects are really directed to those local resource zones. So if I need to build a 30-mile line or a 50-mile line in Mississippi to support the Amazon warehouse that's going there, the people in Mississippi pay for that. So we don't necessarily have that conflict in the market we're in today. If you're in ERCOT, everything's connect and manage, or whatever happens on the backside of manage, but they got a way to do all of that. And so I think it really is important, and understanding, Sai said this, that not only is each data center not a monolith, each region is not a monolith. And so the practices and the needs are going to be very, very different. And we have to recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a how do we learn from the different areas, and what are things that I need to incorporate, and what are things that probably just don't work for me.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot to add. Cost allocation is tricky. I think we all know that in this room. So, insofar as data centers come to communities, they do bring great local benefits. They bring great tax revenue, jobs, not just in data centers, but also in construction industry, manufacturing jobs, all of that. So there are knock-on benefits for data centers coming, and just always want to keep that in mind. And we talk about load growth as just data centers. There will be other waves of this. There will be manufacturing, hydrogen facilities, general electrification. So I think the data center industry is working through a lot of these issues with PJM and with MISO, but hopefully, we can be the first wave to drop, but hopefully this will just benefit.
Just to be clear, I'm talking about the through state.
Okay.
The state that lost the bid for the data center, but has to host a transmission to support that data center.
Yeah, I think that's something the states have to decide amongst themselves. I don't really have a good answer there.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon, the utilities, the customers in the states, and you guys, right, to talk about the benefits, and people just have to make hard decisions. And sometimes they don't make those. I mean, there's no way getting around that.
Am I on? David Strobridge with ITC. So we're talking about speed and utilities and regulations. And, we mentioned federal permitting, but I'm thinking of one in particular in, Order 1000 competition and how that plays into the delays associated with getting these data centers online. And, for example, I think we get a portfolio approved, we have to go through RFP processes, they might have to be staggered. We're voluntarily just waiting 2 years to start development just to pick a project owner. So I'm wondering if, particularly Sai, if you guys have any opinions on how Order 1000 relates to getting data centers online expeditiously.
Yeah, I don't think I have a strong opinion on Order 1000 at the moment. I did see there was a new report from the Data Coalition, so not to be misconstrued with the Data Center Coalition, but I look forward to digging into that report more. And obviously, Order 1000, there's a lot of different opinions there, and from our perspective, we don't have a strong opinion on ROFR at the moment.
Good morning. Bud Vos with Medox International. We're a manufacturer of superconductor technology. I'm curious, well, first of all, I want to say Happy Liberation Day. And
You looked at the stock market?
yes, it was yesterday, but I forgot to get everybody a gift. No, really, my question is in all of these processes and everything that we're talking about, have any of you individually started to factor in the impact that tariffs will have to raw materials and materials for building out all this grand transmission?
We don't have a specific number, but initial reaction was a lot.
Yeah. So in the MISO space, really, we think about this work we've done with these portfolios, and we have this process called variance analysis. So if a project, regardless of who it was awarded to, costs look like they're going to be more than 25%, it's subject to variance analysis, where we kind of really start looking up underneath the hood to understand what should be done to try and deliver the outcome and the results as contemplated. So let me just say I'm not excited to think about that, right? I don't know whether or not we have enough staff and resources to kind of work through just the myriad of issues that we're going to see across the board. And the real flip side of that is, to a certain extent, that really erodes the value that's contemplated by the portfolio. So, I wish I had a more concise, informed answer. Right now, I am preaching and practicing patience.
Yeah, I don't really have a comment on the transmission system. And since yesterday was Liberation Day, we're still trying to kind of figure out what the effects are on our industry.
Hi, this is Manish Jain from Sajid and Lundy. Going back to the interconnection process, so particularly what I'm interested in your panel's opinion on the particularly AI-based data centers. So we have been seeing like the data centers, the load swings in the data centers like between 10 to 15% within few cycles, within seconds. So curious to get your take on that, how the interconnection or the utilities are and the ISOs are planning for those kind of interconnection, where could the 10-15 kind of % of load swings can be taxing on the nearby generators within few cycles. So how are we kind of grappling with this kind of a challenge?
So I can we've had a couple of experiences where we've had one of these large loads trip. And so we are really now starting to ask some questions about what's your resiliency? How do you think? In a way, think about it this way. Almost think about it as an inverter-based resource. What's your ride-through capability? And how do we think about those things? And what, if anything, should we have requirements in that regard for a data center, in the sense of planned outages, or what's your schedule for ramping down and shutting down? So those are some of the things that I think we have thought about a little bit. I don't think that we've had enough experiences, on operations end to really think about what changes should be made, if any. But I think that's a complication also that I think is going to create a lot of headaches in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that gets back to the coordination piece and what is the customer, what do they have online, what's their backup look like, what are their expectations of us, and ensuring if something does happen, and it has, how do we coordinate, for example, with PJM in those instances, and then hopefully learn from that for the next time, because it's obviously a much bigger impact to the system than what we're traditionally used to.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate what Patrick said, just close collaboration between data centers and utilities and grid operators. I think that's kind of the theme of this panel, right? Just need more collaboration between all of us.
Hi, Jason Plouts from E&E News. The DOE this morning said that they had identified some federal sites for possible data center and power generation co-location. Cy, or really anybody on the panel, I was wondering, what do you think about the viability of that? And is that a way to get some of these sites built without some of the challenges that have been discussed today?
Yeah, I think I saw that news last night, so we're still trying to dig in and see kind of what the scope is. I haven't seen the actual report. I just saw the news reporting, so look forward to kind of digging in and talking with members about that. I don't really have a good answer for you right now.
I haven't seen a report either, but I'll just say collectively, I was at a FERC conference, tech conference last fall, and I share my opinion that co-location is a necessary but insufficient option. And I really just remain concerned as we think about co-location. I grew up in a generation of cogeneration where when the plant went offline, then the power plant could go offline. But how do we deal with that from a co-location? So if your generation is not available, but you still want to run your data center, how have we done that, right? How have we dealt with all those things? What's the supporting infrastructure for that? I talked about ride-through when you change the loads there, but what happens if your data center is running full bore, but the generation you have trips offline? So how do you account for those things? And I just think we have to be very, very careful how we consider and think about the options to enable. And I hope that we don't make short-sighted decisions today that actually cost us more time and money tomorrow.
So I'm no expert on data centers or AI. Believe me, not at all on AI. But if you have co-location, and if data centers, understanding some, like at the New York Stock Exchange, have a certain reliability that they need, but others, perhaps data centers back each other up across the country, and we can move from one data center to another. Is there the ability, perhaps, to limit what kind of interconnection is needed to the transmission, like a contract demand, that would help reduce the impact on the overall system? Is that something that, maybe from a data center point of view or from the grid, that could be considered to help address the significant impact of the demand?
Sure. Go for it.
So I think, we're supportive of looking at some of these kind of voluntary demand response programs and seeing how that could work. EPRI actually has a great initiative going, DC Flex, that's looking at the flexibility of data centers, and we have some of our member companies and then industry partners. I'm sure some in this room are a part of that as well. So we're really excited to see what comes out of that. I think it's early days to see kind of where there may be flexibility in the grid, and so we're looking at kind of those expert places to see what we can kind of get from that. But as we talked about earlier, the 5 nines, a lot of our facilities probably don't have that flexibility, but for some that may, I think those avenues are the right places to address that.
The only thing I'd offer to build off of that is the entity willing to stay that way for the balance of its operation? So you say you do it today because it costs less and it works. Are you committed to that being how you do it tomorrow? Because if you're not, then you're not set up for that. And so that's the only thing that I get concerned about. I would plan for it to always be running in the 5 nines. And if you don't need it, that's one thing. I'd be very wary of an entity saying today that this is how we can operate. We're subject to demand response. We're subject to doing whatever, and not have a growth plan that might change the way they would think about operating. Just a thought.
Hey, Tim Mastrogiacomo from Xcel Energy. Thanks for coming here today and talking to us. You know, we heard from Lanny about the very high level of benefits you get compared to cost from some of these big transmission investments. We're hearing a lot about the need for speed, AI, arms race, et cetera. And then opposed to all that, there seems to be an immense amount of time and effort being spent to find ways to slow down transmission development. We have ideas circulating about additional independent reviews of transmission planning that's done, scrutinizing it, second guessing. We have Order 1000 requirements trying to save little bits of money that never seem to materialize, slowing down grid development. And then we have just a lot of criticism of building wires. As a utility, it sometimes feels like being Gulliver in the land of the Lilliputians, right? There's always new things being layered on top of your state reviews, your federal formula reviews, RTO variance analyses, as Aubrey, you mentioned. Given that transmission is such a small component of the overall bill as compared to power, and given the urgency to get data centers and other loads hooked up, do you all think there's a need to rethink what we've been doing in recent years? And I would direct that question at Aubrey or whoever wants to tackle it.
Well, Tim, you know, it's interesting. Most Americans have no idea what their power bill is constructed of. And I think the big issue that we struggle from day one is Lanny hit it. You know, okay, MISO had a $10 billion portfolio. We had a $21.8 billion portfolio. Our MTEP 25 is going to be $11.3 billion. Everybody hears billion, and they lose it. There's 45 million people in the MISO region, right? So everybody ain't playing a billion, right? You kind of divide that over 20 years, it ain't the same number, right? So I actually think that our utilities who actually own the relationships with customers, we have to rethink some of those outreach and concerns and comments as well also. Again, we talk often about the cost of the electricity, of the transmission, of the generation, but we don't talk about the benefits of it. And you'll hear the people say, well, I get the bill, I don't get the benefit. And they'll make that comment. But I think it's important to how we think about what are the billing determinants and tell people that as we increase transmission and we change what our generation makeup is, we're actually going to lower what our energy charge is. And how do you understand that? And so I think we have to think about a way to be more proactive and bring people to the question, if you will, and help them actually understand what electricity actually costs, what you actually do with it, and how affordable it is relative to your gross domestic product, whatever. The household income, the portion of income that's spent on utilities on electricity is less than it was in the early 1920s. And so how do we make people understand that electricity is actually way more affordable than they actually know, and not necessarily be caught up with the sticker shock that we hear as we think about portfolios and we think about transmission investment in that regard. And fundamentally, just simply, you know, we got some math that says basically transmission is like 1/5 the cost of generation. So if your effort is to improve the effectiveness of your generation and reduce your generation bill, you're going to build more transmission.
We're building new projects. We're trying to optimize and expand along existing rights of way. Right? Let's take advantage of what we have. And then at the end of the day, as you know, in a lot of cases, the face of the community, our company, yours, others around the room, like we need to be in the communities. What do you think? How is this impacting you? Like if you're not engaging with even opponents at the local level in trying to explain the benefits as much as they might have trouble with it, then what's the point in that? Like, you know, Aubrey's been talking about new way of thinking. Like, we didn't used to do that as well as I think we do now in terms of engaging with customers. And so ensuring that they understand every part, like over the last 5 years, their share of transmission costs have gone down 10%, data center customer costs have gone up 10%. So that's like a tangible thing that we can communicate to them in terms of how the system is evolving and what it means for them.
I think also, last little point on this is we also have to inform regulators and executives of what's happening in transpiring. So as Patrick talked about, if I go build in an existing right-of-way, you know what's going to happen? I got to take an outage on that facility that's in that right-of-way. You know what could happen? I could have increased congestion. So you know what that could do? is I can have increased fuel charge there. So this is not this is an all the time game. There's no timeouts, right? This is play this all the time. And I think Patrick is spot on. How you have these community meetings, how you have the meetings inside your own organization, how we talk to the regulators about the things that they're saying and calling that out to people. We should be saying, as we do this work, we're going to have outages and we're going to have congestion problems. We're already looking at that as we start thinking about these large portfolios, how we can minimize what that congestion is, but also how we make sure people actually understand it's going to happen.
Time for one more from the audience, if anyone's got any. Yeah.
Theodore Paradise from CTC Global. Thanks for the really good discussion here this morning. So a couple themes that I heard you guys going through. One is, Aubrey, new ways of thinking, taking different approaches to problems. Another one, you talked about permitting and the time to get transmission up and some of the customer demands, right? Which is, can we do this in a year or 2 years versus 10 years? That would be great, right? And Patrick, you talked about, utilizing the grid that we have and the rights of way that we have, most effectively, and the difficulty of doing new transmission. Is the landscape that we have now with, significant load growth for the first time in a long time and historic at this level, changing, for you, Patrick, or Aubrey, how you're thinking about maximizing the existing rights of way. Obviously, I'm with CTC Global. We make advanced conductors, and that's a path of doubling capacity, right, in months versus years around the globe. I think we have 124,000 miles up now, but it is something that I think Bill mentioned it earlier in talking to Lanny, kind of a niche sort of thing. I can't get a new right of way. I have to do a long span. Now the problem to solve is speed. And utilizing the existing rights of way very quick and not running into permitting, not triggering the doubling capacity, or doing live line work. A lot of the reconductorings we see are live line. Is the need to get there quickly, changing how you're thinking about the types of solutions that you're looking at and moving you from a mindset of, we'll get there, the 10-year process, we'll get something out, versus what can we do today in addition to a big 765 deployments, a big set of new lines, and maybe a hybrid of what we can do now versus that big planning.
I think for us, it's parallel, doing things live. That was a new. We did that recently. It worked, thankfully. But I mean, we have a little over 10,000 miles of transmission line, right? So there's a lot to get through, and how do we optimize that? And find the best use cases for those technologies just takes time. And we're going to try and go as quickly as you can. That ensures reliability. And as Aubrey was pointing out in terms of, if we stop here, what are the downstream effects? But again, we went through the RTEP process. We have a lot of big lines proposed through that. And at the same time, we're going through our normal capital investment plan, which also increased quite a bit in our most recent IRP. So we're trying to juggle both.
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, from an RTO perspective, we can only quantify and use generally what our members who have the responsibility use, that they have in their spares. As I think about this in our Tranche 1, we actually have designed a line that has a higher surge impedance limit. And quite frankly, this is the technology from that comes from AEP. And so ultimately, we have people who are studying that. As I think about this, and I think about, a lot of discussion about advanced conductors, and I think part of this has to be a thought of how does it plan to be used? If there's a place where I got to do an upgraded substation to support the usage of it, did I really accomplish anything? But I think the main thing that we've got to do is we've got to make sure that the member utilities who we actually plan and design for have this in their book of stores, that their people are trained in utilization and they're prepared to use that, because today I can't think about or develop a line that if one of my member utilities does not have that in their stores. If that's not equipment that they use, that's kind of out of the game for me to think about as putting it in play for a particular project. So I think that, really, we've got to have that advancement take place with our member utilities. So therefore, we then turn around and update our cost estimation guide. We update the types of materials that are useful for us to select from. And then we further update the stuff that we're using where we are using technology to identify mitigations for other constraints as well.
Thank you. All right. Join me in thanking this panel for a great discussion. Very interesting.